Some betrayals are whispers in the dark. Others arrive with the roar of a 4.0-litre twin-turbo V8 engine. For Amelia Davenport, it arrived on a crisp piece of paper from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Her husband, Richard, a man who built an empire on calculated risks, had just made his last and most foolish gamble. He gifted his mistress a brand-new Porsche Taycan, a machine of exquisite speed and beauty. But in a move of breathtaking arrogance, he put the title in his wife's name. He thought it was a clever financial maneuver. He thought she would never find out. He never imagined that his quiet, unassuming wife would do the one thing he couldn't control, report it stolen. The Davenport Residence, in the manicured hills of North Caldwell, New Jersey, was less a home and more a monument to success. Its limestone facade gleamed in the afternoon sun, a silent testament to Richard Davenport's formidable career in commercial real estate. Every window was perfectly dressed, every hedge sculpted to geometric perfection. It was a life of impeccable order, curated and managed with quiet efficiency by his wife of 15 years, Amelia. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple. Richard, with his tailored Brioni suits and shark-like smile, was the charismatic force of nature who could command a boardroom with a single glance. Amelia, elegant and poised, was the perfect hostess, the devoted mother to their 2 children, and the silent partner who ensured the machinery of their lives ran without a single squeak. She organized the charity galas, managed the household accounts, and remembered the birthdays of Richard's most important clients. She had long ago traded her own promising career in forensic accounting for the full-time job of being Mrs. Davenport. It was a trade Richard had encouraged, praising her intelligence while simultaneously steering her away from any position that might rival his own. The first tremor in this carefully constructed world arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a Sotheby's auction catalogue and a handwritten invitation to the mayor's fundraiser. It was a standard, nondescript envelope from the New Jersey DMV. Amelia, sorting the mail at the polished mahogany desk in their sunroom, slit it open without a thought. Inside was a vehicle registration certificate. The name was hers, Amelia Davenport. The address was correct, but the vehicle described was not her reliable Range Rover or the vintage Mercedes convertible Richard kept for sunny weekends. It was a 2025 Porsche Taycan Turbo S. The color was listed as Mamba Green Metallic. A faint metallic taste filled her mouth. Mamba Green. It sounded like something a 20-something pop star would drive, not a 42-year-old mother of 2. She had never seen this car. She had certainly never purchased it. The listed price on an accompanying insurance declaration made her breath catch over $200,000. That evening, as Richard loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of Macallan 25, she approached him, the papers held delicately between her fingers. "Richard, darling," she began, her voice even and calm. "I received something strange in the mail today." He glanced up from his amber liquid, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before it was replaced by his usual affable mask. "What's that, honey?" She handed him the papers. He scanned them, his expression barely changing. He let out a low chuckle, a sound designed to be dismissive and reassuring. "Ah, that. It's just some paperwork nonsense," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "My accountant, Peterson, set up a new holding company for some vehicle assets to minimize tax liability. He probably put one of the corporate cars under your name for tax structuring. It's boring stuff. Don't worry your pretty head about it." He swirled the scotch, the picture of a man unconcerned. "A green Porsche, god, no. I think it's a black Panamera for one of the executives. They must have just ticked the wrong box at the DMV. You know how incompetent those government clerks are. I'll have Peterson sort it out tomorrow." Amelia looked at her husband. She had studied his face for 15 years. She knew the subtle shift in his jaw when he was closing a difficult deal, the slight crinkle at the edge of his eyes when he was genuinely amused, and the almost imperceptible tightening of his lips when he was lying. His lips were a flat, hard line. "I see," she said softly, taking the papers back. It just seemed so specific. "It's nothing, Amy," he said, his voice softening as he used his pet name for her, a tool he often deployed to end a conversation. "Just a clerical error." She retreated to her office, the sunroom now feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a pristine, sterile cage. A clerical error. For 15 years she had managed their complex finances. She knew their accountant, Robert Peterson, was meticulously thorough. He didn't make clerical errors of this magnitude. And Richard, a man who could recall the square footage and zoning restrictions of a property he'd glanced at 5 years ago, would never be so vague about a $200,000 asset. The lie was not clumsy, it was arrogant. He hadn't bothered to craft a believable story because he didn't think he needed to. He believed she was no longer the sharp, inquisitive woman he had married, the one who could spot a fraudulent entry in a ledger from 10 paces away. He saw her only as a beautiful fixture in the monument he had built. That night, as Richard slept soundly beside her, his breathing deep and even, Amelia lay awake, staring into the darkness. The image of a Mamba Green Porsche burned behind her eyelids. It wasn't just a car. It was a secret. And for the first time in a long, long time, the forensic accountant inside her stirred from her slumber. She wasn't worried, as Richard had told her not to be. She was curious. And her curiosity was a cold, quiet thing, as sharp and as patient as a scalpel. She would find the truth. She would follow the paper trail, and she would do it with the same meticulous precision she once applied to corporate balance sheets, because she had a sickening feeling that the biggest fraud she would ever uncover was her own life. The next morning, Amelia woke with a chilling sense of purpose. While Richard went through his morning routine, a workout with his personal trainer, a protein shake, a quick scan of the Wall Street Journal, she made coffee and packed the children's lunches, playing the part of the dutiful wife with practiced ease. But behind her serene smile, her mind was already at work mapping out her investigation. Her first stop was the source of all modern secrets, the family's finances. Richard had given her access to all their accounts years ago, not as a sign of trust, but as an act of delegation. He couldn't be bothered with the mundanity of paying bills or tracking expenditures. He hadn't logged into the main bank portal himself in at least 5 years, confident that Amelia would handle it. It was another of his grand miscalculations. Seated at her mahogany desk, the sunroom now her war room, she bypassed their joint checking and savings accounts. A purchase like that wouldn't be so obvious. She delved into Richard's business credit card statements, the ones he used for client entertainment. Her eyes, trained to find anomalies, scanned months of entries. There were the usual $500 dinners at Del Frisco's, the charges from private golf clubs, the recurring payments to a high-end car service. And then she found it. 3 months ago, a series of charges at a restaurant she'd never heard of, La Sirena, a trendy, intimate Italian place in Soho. Not Richard's usual steakhouse haunt. The charges were frequent almost weekly, and always for 2. Then a charge from a boutique jewelry store on Madison Avenue, Belgari, for a sum that made her stomach clench, $32,000. It wasn't for an anniversary or her birthday. The final piece, the one that connected it all, was a wire transfer from one of Richard's subsidiary real estate accounts, one he probably thought she didn't monitor. $210,450 paid to Princeton Porsche. The date was exactly 1 week before the registration had been issued in her name. The lie about the accountant and the corporate car wasn't just a lie. It was an insult to her intelligence. He had used marital funds channeled through his business to buy a luxury car and expensive jewelry, and he had put the car in her name. Why the old accountant in her supplied the answer instantly. If he put it in his own name, it would be an obvious marital asset in any potential divorce. If he put it in his mistress's name and the purchase was ever discovered, it could be legally clawed back as a fraudulent transfer of marital property. Putting it in Amelia's name was the height of cynical genius. It kept the asset technically within the marriage, avoiding any suggestion of hiding funds. He could claim it was a gift for her, a surprise, perhaps, that he simply let a friend borrow. He had created a perfect legal shield, assuming his wife was too complacent to ever question it. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a spreadsheet of damning facts. But facts were not enough. She needed to see it. She needed to see the woman. She remembered an old colleague from her accounting firm who had left to start a private investigation agency. A quick, discreet phone call and a substantial transfer from a personal account she'd maintained since before her marriage set the wheels in motion. She gave the PI, a gruff but efficient man named Dawson. The only leads she had the name of the restaurant, La Sirena, and the description of the car. It took Dawson less than 48 hours. The email arrived late on Thursday night. The subject line was simply, "Subject confirmation." Inside was a folder of high-resolution photographs. The first few showed the Mamba Green Porsche Taycan. It was parked brazenly in the private garage of a new, impossibly chic condominium building in Chelsea. It was as loud and ostentatious as she had imagined. Then came the photos of the driver, a young woman perhaps in her late 20s, with long dark hair, and the kind of effortless style that costs a fortune to maintain. She was laughing, climbing out of the driver's seat, a Bulgari Serpenti bracelet, $32,000 worth, coiled around her wrist. In several shots, Richard was with her. He was holding her hand. His head tilted towards her as she spoke, a genuine, unguarded smile on his face. A smile Amelia hadn't seen directed at her in years. Dawson had even gotten a name from the condo's directory, Isabella Rossi, an aspiring interior designer. Amelia stared at the screen, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She clicked through the images, each one a fresh stab. There was Richard, her husband, living a completely different life, a vibrant, passionate life financed by their shared fortune. He had not only given this woman his time and affection, he had given her a piece of Amelia's own identity, stamping her name on the title of their secret. She felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. But it wasn't a hot, screaming rage. It was arctic. It was the calm, methodical fury of a woman who had been underestimated, disrespected, and discarded. He thought she was just a pretty head. He thought she was a decorative object in his perfect house. He had no idea who he was dealing with. She closed the laptop. She walked over to the window and looked out at the perfectly manicured lawn, the symbol of her gilded cage. For years she had played by the rules. She had been the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect partner. And this was her reward. She took a deep, steadying breath. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Emotion was a liability. What she needed now was a strategy. Richard understood business risk and leverage. She would speak to him in the only language he truly respected. The car was the key. It was his grand, arrogant mistake. He had put a weapon in her hand and wrapped it in a title certificate with her name on it. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady. She didn't call Richard. She didn't call a divorce lawyer. Not yet. She scrolled through her contacts and dialed a number she hadn't called in a long time. 911. What is your emergency? The operator's voice was clipped. Professional. Amelia's voice when she spoke was the epitome of calm distress. Hello, she said, her tone perfectly modulated. I would like to report a grand theft auto. My car, my Porsche Taycan, has been stolen. Isabella Rossi felt on top of the world. She glided the Mamba Green Taycan through the streets of Greenwich Village, the electric hum of the engine, a subtle symphony of power beneath her. The car was more than a vehicle. It was a trophy. It was tangible proof that she had won. Richard had told her the car was in his wife's name for complex tax reasons, a story she readily accepted, because questioning it would mean questioning the fantasy he had so carefully constructed for her. He was getting a divorce, he'd said. It was just a matter of time. Amelia was fragile, and he had to handle it delicately. Tonight she was meeting two of her girlfriends for dinner at Carbone. Pulling up to the valet was a moment she savoured. The way heads turned, the way the valet's eyes widened at the sight of the other worldly green machine. This car announced her arrival, not just at the restaurant, but in a new echelon of society. An hour later, full of expensive wine and truffle pasta, they emerged laughing onto the sidewalk. As the valet pulled the Porsche around its vibrant colour, glowing under the streetlights, Isabella felt a familiar surge of pride. But as she reached for the door handle, the night was split by the jarring high-low wail of a siren. A NYPD cruiser slid to a stop directly behind the Taycan, its red and blue lights painting the street in frantic, strobing colours. Two officers emerged, their expressions grim. One, a tall, stern-looking sergeant, approached the valet, while the other walked toward her. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" the officer asked, his hand resting near his sidearm. Isabella's smile faltered. "Yes, it is." "Is there a problem, officer?" Her friends stood back, their amusement turning to concern. "We received a report that this vehicle has been stolen," the officer said flatly. "License plate matches the bolo. Can I see your license and registration?" Isabella's blood ran cold. "Stolen, that's impossible. It's a misunderstanding. This is my car. It was a gift. I just need to see the paperwork, ma'am." Her hands trembled as she retrieved the registration and her driver's license from the glove compartment. The officer took them his flashlight beam, scanning the documents. "The registration is for an Amelia Davenport of North Caldwell, New Jersey," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Are you Amelia Davenport?" "No, but she's my friend's wife." Isabella stammered the words, tasting like ash. The lie was flimsy and ridiculous even to her own ears. "He's buying it for me." "It's complicated." "It's not complicated for me, ma'am," the sergeant cut in, having joined them. "The registered owner, Ms. Amelia Davenport, reported the vehicle stolen from her residence in New Jersey 2 hours ago. As far as we're concerned, this is a stolen vehicle. We need you to step away from the car." Humiliation washed over Isabella in a hot, sickening wave. People on the street were stopping to watch. Her friends were staring their faces, a mixture of shock and pity. This was supposed to be her moment of triumph, and it was curdling into a public spectacle of shame. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice rising with panic. "Call Richard Davenport. He'll clear this all up. This is his car, ma'am. Right now, this is Ms. Amelia Davenport's car." The sergeant repeated his patience, wearing thin. "And it's being impounded as evidence. You can call Mr. Davenport from the precinct. We have a few questions for you." Meanwhile, in North Caldwell, Detective Miller of the local police department sat in his office, the phone pressed to his ear. On the line was Amelia Davenport. He had handled dozens of stolen car reports in his career, and they usually involved hysterical or furious owners. Mrs. Davenport was different. She was preternaturally calm. She had the VIN, the license plate number, the date of purchase, and a digital copy of the title, which she had already emailed to him. "And you're certain you didn't lend the car to anyone, Mrs. Davenport?" he asked, a standard procedural question. There was a slight pause. "No," Detective Amelia replied, her voice firm. "I have never even seen the car. I believe it was taken from the dealership or a storage facility before I could even take possession. I would never authorize anyone to drive it." It was a masterful statement, technically true and legally airtight. She hadn't authorized it. An hour later, the call came in from NYPD's 6th Precinct. They had the vehicle. And they had a very distraught, very uncooperative woman named Isabella Rossi in custody for questioning. Richard Davenport was in a board meeting finalizing a billion-dollar deal for a new commercial development in Jersey City when his phone began to vibrate incessantly. He ignored it, silencing it with an irritated flick of his thumb. But it buzzed again and again. Finally, he saw the text message all in caps from a number he knew belonged to Isabella. "Call me. Police have the car. I'm at the station." His blood turned to ice. He excused himself abruptly from the meeting, his mind racing. It had to be a mistake. A parking ticket, a minor fender bender. But as he called her number, a male voice answered. It was a detective from the 6th Precinct in New York. The conversation was short, brutal, and stripped him of all his power. His mistress was being questioned in connection with a stolen vehicle. The vehicle registered to his wife. A vehicle reported stolen by his wife. The intricate, arrogant web he had woven had just been set ablaze. He drove to the city in a state of controlled panic, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of Amelia's move. He had grossly, catastrophically underestimated her. This wasn't an emotional outburst. This was a strategic, calculated strike aimed directly at his weak point. When he arrived at the precinct, the scene was even worse than he'd imagined. Isabella was sitting on a hard plastic chair, her face streaked with mascara, her designer dress looking tragically out of place. She flew at him the moment she saw him. "Richard. Tell them you gave me the car," she hissed, her voice a mixture of fear and fury. Richard tried to deploy his signature charm on the detective. "Officer, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he began, his voice smooth as silk. "This is my associate, Ms. Rossi. The car belongs to my wife, but I allowed Ms. Rossi to use it." My wife must have been confused. The detective just looked at him, unimpressed. "Your wife didn't seem confused, Mr. Davenport. She was very clear. She is the owner, and she did not give anyone permission to have her car. As of now, the Taycan is in an impound lot, pending investigation. And unless your wife comes down here and retracts her statement, Rossi is in a great deal of trouble for possession of stolen property." Richard stared at the detective, the color draining from his face. "Retract her statement, Amelia?" He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she would do no such thing. He finally managed to get Isabella released, pending further investigation, after a tense conversation with his high-priced lawyer over the phone. He walked her out onto the street, the flashing lights of the city a blur. "You have to fix this," rich Isabella sobbed, grabbing his arm. "My reputation. That car. You promised me." But Richard was barely listening. His mind was on the drive home, on the silent limestone monument of a house waiting for him. The war had begun, and he had just realized he was no longer the commander. He walked through the front door close to midnight. The house was quiet and dark, save for a single light in the sunroom. Amelia was sitting at her desk, not with tears in her eyes, but with a cool, unreadable expression. In front of her, spread out like battle plans, was a thin folder. "Hello, Richard," she said, her voice as calm and as cold as a winter morning. I think it's time we discussed our assets. The sunroom, once a symbol of domestic tranquility, had become a boardroom for the dissolution of a marriage. The air was thick with a tension that the expensive air purifiers couldn't touch. Amelia didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her quiet composure was more unnerving than any tirade. "The car is a marital asset, Richard," she stated, her voice level. "Purchased with funds from a joint marital account, laundered through one of your business subsidiaries. A clumsy attempt to disguise it, by the way. You should have used a shell corp registered in Delaware. The LLC in New Jersey is too easily traced back to us." Richard stared at her flabbergasted. This wasn't the wife he knew. This was a ruthless auditor, dissecting his life's work with surgical precision. "You reported it stolen. Amelia. You could have sent Isabella to jail. You could have created a massive scandal." He sputtered, trying to seize the moral high ground where there was none. "You created the scandal, Richard," she corrected him calmly. "You committed adultery. You misappropriated over $200,000 of our money. You committed a form of fraud by placing the title in my name under false pretenses to shield it. I simply protected my asset, an asset, I might add, that is legally mine." The police agreed. She gestured to the folder. "I've taken the liberty of compiling all the relevant documents, the bank statements, the wire transfer confirmation, a copy of the title, and the police report. I believe the term for this is leverage." The following days descended into a maelstrom of legal warfare. Richard, accustomed to solving problems by throwing money and powerful lawyers at them, found himself completely stonewalled. He hired a notoriously aggressive divorce attorney, Arthur Kane, a man known for crushing opponents into submission. Kane's first move was a threatening letter accusing Amelia of filing a false police report and malicious prosecution. He demanded she immediately withdraw the report and release the car or face civil and criminal charges. Amelia simply forwarded the letter to her own counsel. She hadn't hired a flashy downtown firm. She had called Genevieve Jen Harding, an old friend from her university days, who now ran a boutique family law practice. Jen was brilliant, incisive, and had a reputation for being underestimated, much like Amelia herself. Jen's response was a masterclass in legal evisceration. Mr. Kane, her letter read, "Your client seems to be operating under a number of grave misapprehensions. Ms. Davenport is the legal titled owner of the vehicle in question. She did not authorize its use by your client's paramour, Ms. Rossi. Therefore, her report to the police was factually accurate and filed in good faith. If your client wishes to argue in a court of law that he purchased said vehicle with marital funds for his mistress and deliberately titled it in his wife's name to defraud her in a potential divorce settlement, we welcome him to make that deposition under oath. I'm sure the district attorney's office and the IRS would be fascinated to hear such a confession." The letter ended by stating that any further attempts to intimidate their client would be met with a motion for sanctions and a restraining order. Arthur Kane was silent for a week. Meanwhile, Richard's two-front war was becoming increasingly costly. On one side, he had Amelia, an immovable object armed with unassailable facts. On the other, he had Isabella, a volatile force of chaos. Stripped of her prized Porsche and publicly humiliated, Isabella was not going away quietly. Her tearful, panicked calls to Richard soon turned into angry, demanding ones. She wanted a replacement car. She wanted money for her emotional distress. She wanted him to punish Amelia. "She can't do this to us, Rich." She'd wail over the phone. "You're Richard Davenport. You have to fix it." But Richard couldn't fix it. The car was locked in a police impound lot, a $200,000 piece of evidence. Getting it released required Amelia's signature, something Jen Harding had made clear would only happen as part of a final, comprehensive settlement agreement. Desperate, Richard tried to placate Isabella by wiring her $50,000 and leasing a new Mercedes for her. It was a temporary solution that only signaled his weakness. Isabella, realizing her position, began to escalate her demands. She hinted that a certain high-profile gossip columnist might be very interested in the story of the real estate tycoon, his quiet wife, and the stolen Porsche. The pressure began to affect Richard's professional life. The story, while not yet public, was seeping into the closed circles of New Jersey's elite. Whispers followed him at the country club. His business partner, Marcus Thorne, a pragmatic and cautious man, confronted him in his office. "Rich, I'm hearing things," Marcus said, closing the door. "Ugly things. About a car, the police. Isabella. Is this going to be a problem?" "It's a domestic issue, Marcus. I'm handling it," Richard said, his voice tight. "Domestic issues have a way of becoming business problems," Marcus countered. "We have investors on the Jersey City project who value stability. They value reputation. A messy public divorce involving fraud allegations and a stolen supercar is not the kind of press we need. Settle it, and settle it quietly." Richard felt the walls closing in. He was hemorrhaging money to lawyers and to Isabella. His business was under threat. His home life was a frozen tundra. He tried to appeal to Amelia, directly cornering her in the kitchen one evening. "Amy, please." He begged his arrogance, replaced by a raw desperation she'd never seen before. "Let's just stop this. Let the girl have the car. We can work out the rest. Think of the children." Amelia turned from the sink, her hands dripping water. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of detached pity. "I am thinking of the children, Richard," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "I'm thinking of their future, a future that needs to be secured from a father who would gamble it away on a passing infatuation. You don't seem to understand. The car was never the point. It was the proof. This is a business negotiation now. And in this negotiation, I hold all the cards." She dried her hands and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the cavernous, silent kitchen. He had built an empire on seeing every angle, on anticipating every move his opponents would make. But he had never once looked across the dinner table and seen the brilliant, formidable adversary who had been sitting there all along. The final negotiation was held not in a contentious courtroom, but in the sterile, neutral territory of Jen Harding's conference room. The polished glass table reflected the strained faces of the participants. Richard sat flanked by his lawyer, Arthur Kane, looking diminished and exhausted. The usual aura of power that surrounded him had evaporated, replaced by the weary resignation of a defeated king. Amelia sat opposite them next to Jen. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue dress. Her posture was perfect, her expression serene. She held a pen, but she did not fidget. She was the picture of control. Jen Harding laid out the settlement agreement on the table. It was not a proposal. It was a list of terms. They were brutal, comprehensive, and utterly non-negotiable. "Let's review the primary points," Jen began, her voice crisp. "Ms. Davenport will receive sole and exclusive ownership of the North Caldwell residence, free and clear of any encumbrance. She will receive 60% of all liquid assets, including brokerage accounts, savings, and retirement funds." This percentage is reflective of Mr. Davenport's fraudulent conveyance of marital funds during the marriage. Arthur Kane started to protest, but Jen held up a hand. "Furthermore, Ms. Davenport will be awarded a 40% stake in Davenport Commercial Properties, LLC. This will be a non-voting stake, ensuring Mr. Davenport retains operational control, but it guarantees Ms. Davenport a significant share of all future profits and a seat on the advisory board. Richard's head snapped up. 40%. That's my business. I built it from nothing. You built it with the support of a 15-year marriage that you violated, Jen countered coolly. My client gave up her own career to facilitate your success. This is her deferred compensation. Take the deal or we litigate. And when we litigate, we will be subpoenaing Ms. Isabella Rossi the full details of your affair and the fraudulent purchase of the vehicle. We will ask the court for 70%, and we will likely get it along with a referral to the IRS for a tax audit. Your partner, Mr. Thorne, has already been contacted for a preliminary deposition. I believe he is quite motivated to see this matter resolved swiftly and silently. The mention of Marcus was a checkmate. Richard slumped in his chair, defeated. Kane whispered furiously in his ear, but they both knew they had no moves left. Finally, Jen said, sliding one last page across the table. The matter of the 2025 Porsche Taycan Turbo S, currently held in police impound. Richard looked at Amelia, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Maybe this was it. The one concession. He could give the car to Isabella and at least salvage something from that disastrous relationship. Ms. Davenport agrees to sign the release forms for the vehicle, Jen said. Richard visibly relaxed, and she will be taking possession of it immediately. Jen finished. The air went out of Richard's lungs. What is she going to do with a Mamba Green Porsche? Amelia spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the legal jargon. That's my business, Richard. He signed the papers. His signature, usually a bold, confident slash, was the shaky scrawl of a broken man. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Richard moved out of the limestone monument and into a sterile luxury apartment downtown. His empire was still intact, but it was diminished, and he now had a silent partner to whom he was accountable, a partner who had once organized his dinner parties. Isabella Rossi, upon learning that Richard had not only failed to retrieve her car, but had signed it over to his wife, sent a barrage of furious texts and threats. Richard's lawyer responded with a final check for $100,000 and a cease and desist letter so ironclad that she was legally barred from even mentioning his name in public. She took the money and disappeared, her 15 minutes of fame ending in a quiet, bitter payout. A week later, a flatbed truck from Princeton Porsche arrived at the NYPD impound lot. They collected the Taycan, detailed it to gleaming perfection, and delivered it to the driveway of the North Caldwell house. Amelia walked out to look at it. It was beautiful, audacious, and dripping with the memory of betrayal. She ran a hand over the garish green paint. She had never wanted it. Owning it wasn't the victory. The victory came a month later. Amelia, using the capital from her settlement and the proceeds from the immediate sale of the Porsche back to the dealership, opened her own firm, Davenport Financial Forensics and Consulting. Her first major client was a women's advocacy group for whom she offered pro bono services, helping women in contentious divorces uncover hidden assets. Her new office was sleek and modern, with a view of the New York skyline. One afternoon, her first official dividend check from Davenport Commercial Properties arrived. It was for a substantial amount. She looked at the check signed with her ex-husband's shaky signature and then looked out the window at the city. She hadn't just survived. She hadn't just gotten revenge. She had reclaimed her life, not the one that had been built for her, but the one she should have been building for herself all along. The Mamba Green Porsche had been a symbol of Richard's betrayal, but in the end, Amelia had turned it into the vehicle of her own liberation. 6 months after the signing, the world had settled into a new, unfamiliar alignment. For Amelia, This new world was one of crisp autumn light flooding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office in Montclair. Davenport Financial Forensics and Consulting was no longer just a name on a letterhead. It was a burgeoning reality. Her reputation, honed by her pro bono work and amplified by Jen Harding's discreet referrals, was growing. She was gaining a name as the woman you hired when you needed to find the unfindable, the lawyer's secret weapon in contentious, high-net-worth divorces. Her days were filled with asset tracing, poring over encrypted ledgers, and quiet, powerful meetings where she armed other women with the facts they needed to reclaim their own lives. She had moved on. The Mamba Green Porsche was a distant, almost comical memory. The limestone house in North Caldwell, now solely hers, felt less like a cage and more like a fortress, a home for her and the children whose lives she had carefully insulated from the worst of the fallout. She had believed the war was over. She had won the decisive battle, secured the territory, and signed the treaty. But she had forgotten a fundamental rule of war. A defeated empire does not simply vanish. It smolders. And its resentful emperor, even in exile, will always search for a way to poison the victor's land. For Richard Davenport, exile was a 3-bedroom apartment on the Gold Coast of the Hudson, with a spectacular view of the skyline he no longer felt he commanded. The apartment was luxurious, sterile, and punishingly quiet. His business, Davenport Commercial Properties, was stable. The 40% non-voting stake owned by his ex-wife was a constant, galling reminder of his defeat, a line item of humiliation on his quarterly reports. He had operational control, but he was shackled. Every major decision was scrutinized, every profit shared. He would stand at his window at night, a glass of scotch in his hand, a lesser vintage now, and look across the river. He would see the lights of the city, and all he could think of was Amelia's triumph. He'd seen the small feature on her firm in a local business journal. The article praised her meticulous approach and unwavering dedication to her clients. They called her a rising star. They were celebrating her for using the very skills he had encouraged her to abandon. The bitterness was a physical thing, an acid that churned in his gut. He had lost his wife, his home, a vast portion of his fortune, and worst of all, his status as an untouchable. The whispers at the club had died down, replaced by something worse, a careful, pitying politeness. He was no longer the shark. He was a cautionary tale. And it was this slow-burning rage that drove him to his next campaign. It couldn't be a frontal assault. Jen Harding's legal architecture was impregnable. So he began a quiet, insidious war of whispers. He wouldn't use lawyers. He would use his oldest and most reliable weapon, his network. His first target was a potential client for Amelia, a woman named Caroline Abbott, the wife of a hedge fund manager whom he knew through the club. Richard arranged a chance encounter with the husband, Michael Abbott, on the golf course. "Michael, good to see you," Richard said, his voice oozing practiced charm. "Heard Caroline is looking for some financial advice. Tough situation." Michael nodded grimly. "It's a mess, Rich. I heard she was talking to Amelia's new firm." Richard continued, shaking his head with faux sympathy. "Look, Amelia's brilliant. No one denies that. But she's going through a lot. Very emotional. The divorce, it left her quite vindictive. I just hate to see you guys get caught in the crossfire of her working out her own issues. Her approach can be scorched earth. It can make a difficult situation 10 times uglier and a lot more expensive." He let the poison hang in the air, then clapped Michael on the shoulder. "Just some friendly advice. You want someone with a cooler head, less personal baggage." 2 days later, Caroline Abbott's lawyer called Amelia's office and cancelled their scheduled consultation offering a vague, apologetic excuse. Amelia felt the sting of disappointment, but thought little of it. Clients got cold feet. But then it happened again. A referral from a major accounting firm in the city, a case that seemed like a sure thing, suddenly went silent. The partner who had referred her, a man she knew slightly, was suddenly cool and distant on the phone. The third time was the most direct. She was in the final stages of a contract with a woman whose husband, a prominent surgeon, was hiding assets in offshore accounts. Amelia had already found the accounts. It was a slam dunk. Then the client called her, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Amelia, I don't think I can proceed," the woman said. "My husband's lawyer, he told my lawyer that you're known for being reckless, that you have a reputation for making things personal, and that you're under investigation for filing a false police report in your own divorce." The lie was so audacious, so patently false, that Amelia felt a jolt of ice water in her veins. The police report had been validated. There was no investigation. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a coordinated attack. There was only one person with the motive and the means to orchestrate such a campaign: Richard. He couldn't attack her on the facts, so he was attacking her reputation. He was trying to dismantle her new life, brick by brick, with lies and innuendo. The old Amelia might have despaired. The new Amelia got to work. She was a forensic accountant. Her entire profession was about following the faintest trails through layers of obfuscation to find the source. She would apply that same methodology to this. She started with the surgeon's husband. Who was his lawyer? A quick search revealed he was represented by a firm Richard had used for zoning appeals for years. She made a call to a friend who worked in legal recruiting. "What's the word on the street about my firm?" she asked casually. The friend hesitated. "Well, you're getting great results, Amelia. But some of the old guard, the boys' club? They're saying you're a loose cannon, a scorned woman with an axe to grind." The language was Richard's. The scorned woman. Narrative was his masterpiece of misogynistic spin. The final piece of confirmation came from a source she hadn't expected. Marcus Thorne, Richard's business partner, called her. "Amelia," he said, his voice strained. "We need to talk. It's about Richard. He met her for coffee in a discreet cafe, far from their usual orbits. He's becoming a liability, Marcus confessed. He's bad-mouthing you all over town. It's not just unprofessional. It's obsessive. He's spending more time trying to undermine your business than he is focusing on ours. He tried to pressure me into pulling our corporate accounts from a bank because one of its board members hired you for his daughter's divorce. He's out of control and it's making us all look bad." That was all she needed. She now had the motive, the method, and the corroboration. It was time for the final reckoning. Not with lawyers, not with documents, face to face. She found out from a contact that Richard was hosting a small exclusive dinner for potential investors at the private Founders Room at the Hamilton Club, his old bastion of power. She wasn't a member, but the club manager, a man for whom she had arranged a dozen perfect charity functions, owed her a favor. She called him. She arrived as they were finishing dessert. She walked past the host and entered the private room without knocking. The 5 men at the table titans of New Jersey real estate and finance fell silent. Richard was mid-anecdote, a glass of wine in his hand. The color drained from his face when he saw her. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Amelia," he stammered. "This is a private dinner." "I know," she said, her voice calm and low, yet it carried across the room. "Gentlemen, please forgive the intrusion. I have a brief piece of business to discuss with my former partner." She walked directly to the table and stood behind the empty chair beside Richard. She looked directly at him, her eyes holding none of the old warmth, only the cold, hard brilliance of a diamond. "You've been busy, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, for his ears only. spreading rumors, poisoning wells, trying to undo the one thing I've built for myself. It's pathetic. And it's over. I don't know what you're talking about, he blustered, trying to maintain his composure in front of his guests. Oh, I think you do, she said. She leaned down slightly, her voice a blade of ice. When I went through our finances, I focused on the marital assets. I was fair. I stuck to the terms of our life together. But I saw everything, Richard. I saw the accounts in the Caymans you set up before we were married. I saw the consulting fee you paid to a shell corporation owned by that councilman from Hoboken back in 2008 to get the waterfront zoning changed. A payment you never declared. A bribe, I believe, is the common term for it. Richard's face went slack. His skin turned a pasty ashen grey. This was the skeleton she had kept in the closet. The one piece of leverage she had held in reserve, a nuclear option she had prayed she would never have to use. That file, she continued, her voice still a whisper, sits in a secure vault. It contains bank records, shell company charters, and a timeline that aligns perfectly with the zoning vote. The statute of limitations on tax evasion is complex, but for felony bribery, it's much less forgiving. If I ever hear so much as a whisper about my firm, my character, or my clients, again, if a single contract mysteriously vanishes, that entire file goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I won't even have to send it myself. Marcus is very concerned about the company's reputation. I'm sure he would feel compelled to do his duty as a responsible officer of the court. She straightened up, her poise absolute. She gave a polite, tight-lipped smile to the stunned men at the table. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice returning to a normal, pleasant volume. "My apologies again for the interruption. Richard will be expecting the quarterly dividend report on Friday. Please be punctual." She turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel the weight of his utter and complete defeat behind her. She had not just won the war. She had salted the earth of his battlefield, ensuring he could never raise an army against her again. He was no longer a ghost haunting her new life. He was just an echo in a room she had already left, a man trapped forever in the ashes of the empire he himself had burned to the ground. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a stolen car. It was about the theft of trust, respect, and 15 years of a woman's life. Richard Davenport believed the rules of the world didn't apply to him, and that the woman by his side was merely a passive observer in his grand life. He learned the hard way that a quiet presence can hide a brilliant mind, and that when you push someone who has nothing left to lose, you create an opponent you can never defeat. Amelia didn't just take back her name from the title of a car. She took back her power, her career, and her future. "What did you think of Amelia's incredible strategy?" was her response justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about when crossing the line has catastrophic consequences, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more true life dramas.